Today we are going to be discussing the confidence interval for categorical data or proportions for both one sample and two sample. Starting off, how do we know how to even do a one sample or two sample z-interval? In an AP statistics exam, the question for a one sample z-interval would typically say construct and interpret a C% confidence interval for the proportion of all blank. And for a two sample z-interval, instead of for the proportion of all blank, it would say for the difference between the proportion of blank and blank. You can easily solve both by using a state plan do conclude structure. For the state section, you need to identify what parameter you want to estimate and at what confidence level. A lot of times we forget to mention the confidence level, but it is an important part to acknowledge. Typically, for a one sample z-interval, what we would say in this section is we want to estimate the true proportion of blank at a C% confidence level. For a two sample z-interval, it is a little more complicated because there are two proportions. We'd have to mention what P1 is equal to and what P2 is equal to in context, and also state we want to estimate the difference P1 minus P2 at a C% confidence level. Many people mistakenly write P1 hat and P2 hat. However, this is incorrect, as we are trying to estimate the population proportions, not the sample proportions. For the plan section, we first need to identify the appropriate type of confidence interval by name, and then check conditions. So for a one sample z-interval, we write out one sample z-interval for population P. And for a two sample z-interval, we would write out two sample z-interval for difference of proportions P1 minus P2. Then we would verify any conditions that need to be met in order to carry out the interval. For one sample and two sample confidence z-interval for proportions, check if there is random sampling or random assignment. In the case of the two sample z-interval, we would make sure both samples were randomly selected or assigned. We would also need to check the 10% condition if we are sampling without replacement, where for a one sample z-interval, the sample size has to be less than 10% of the population. And for a two sample z-interval, both sample sizes have to be less than 10% of the population. For the AP exam, however, they are not very strict on performing the 10% condition. Lastly, we would need to check if the sampling distribution of p hat is approximately normal using the large counts condition. For a one sample z-interval, the large counts condition is satisfied if np hat and n times 1 minus p hat are all at least 10. And for a two sample z-interval, the counts of successes and failures in each sample or group, n1 times p hat 1, n1 times 1 minus p hat 1, n2 times 1 minus p hat 2, and n2 times p hat 2 are all at least 10. Also, as a reminder, to save time and not accidentally write p instead of p hat, it is not necessary to explicitly write out the variables of n and p hat 1 and etc. You can automatically plug in the numbers of the values. For the do section, we have to perform calculations. For the one sample z-interval, we can calculate the interval by using the equation p hat plus minus z star times p hat times 1 minus p hat over n. To remind you, the z star value is the critical value and corresponds with whatever confidence level the question asks of you. It can be found on the formula sheet. You can also use your calculator to find the confidence interval. You go to stats, then tests, and scroll down to 1 prop z int, and input the values, where x over n is your sample proportion and c level is your confidence level. The calculator will generate the confidence interval. For the two sample z-interval, we can calculate the interval by using the equation p1 hat minus p2 hat plus minus z star square root p1 hat times 1 minus p1 hat over n1 plus p2 hat times 1 minus p2 hat over n2. You can also, again, use your calculator by pressing stats, then tests, then scrolling down to 2 prop z interval, and input the values. If you do choose to use your calculator on the AP exam, please remember if you show no work in just the interval, you will either get full credit for the do step or no credit. Be sure to name the procedure 1 prop z int or 2 prop z int, the p hat value or values, the z value, and the interval. For the final section, the conclude section, interpret the interval in the context of the situation. For the one sample z-interval, the conclusion would be we are C% confident that the interval blank to blank captures the true proportion of whatever the context is. And for the two sample z-interval, the conclusion would be we are C% confident that the interval blank to blank captures the true difference in the proportion of what P1 represents in context and what P2 represents in context. A good practice problem related to a one sample z confidence interval is on the 2017 AP Statistics free response question 2. This free response was released on the College Board website and will be linked in the description box.